There are figures in history who do not simply hold power, they bend it, shape it, redefine it. Cleopatra was one of those rare forces who understood something most leaders, ancient or modern, never fully master. Influence is more dangerous than armies and more enduring than empires. Long before her name became wrapped in legend, she wielded a kind of presence that could destabilize a room, redirect a negotiation, or shift the course of nations without ever drawing a sword. As Chrysippus reminded his students, a mind disciplined by reason cannot be conquered by circumstance. And Cleopatra lived at the exact intersection between intellect and instinct, where survival required clarity, emotional composure, and a strategic calm that most of her enemies never saw coming. Yet our world still insists on misunderstanding her. We reduce her to beauty, romance, or scandal because it is easier to mythologize a woman than to confront the truth of her discipline. Stoicism forces us to look deeper, to see the mind behind the myth. According to Zeno, the aim is a steady mind while everything else rises and falls. And few people in the ancient world remained as steady as Cleopatra while navigating betrayals, civil wars, collapsing alliances, and a political environment engineered to erase women from power. She did not rule by force. She ruled by clarity. She ruled by understanding human nature more precisely than the men who underestimated her. This is what brings us here, not to glorify or condemn her, but to examine her through the Stoic lens, not as a seductress or a symbol, but as a strategist navigating the most dangerous political landscape of her time. And in doing so, we learn more than history. We learn something about influence, ego, and the pursuit of inner mastery in our own lives. Welcome to the Stoic Lighthouse. Let the Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward peace and wisdom. If this reflection already sparked a thought within you, hit the like button now and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you won't miss the chapters ahead where philosophy meets the anatomy of power. Number 1. The mind that outshined beauty. There is a persistent illusion in history that beauty is a kind of magic, an effortless force that bends the will of powerful men. But Cleopatra's true influence had nothing to do with ornament or seduction. Her real weapon was a disciplined mind capable of navigating political storms with a level of clarity that terrified her rivals. The ancient world judged women by appearance because it could not comprehend the threat posed by intelligence. Yet Cleopatra understood something most leaders never learn. Presence is not created by looks, but by awareness. According to Marcus Aurelius, the strength of a person is revealed in the control of their own mind, and Cleopatra embodied that strength. She read people, predicted motives, and operated with a level of emotional precision that modern psychologists would call exceptional. Her beauty may have opened doors, but it was her strategic calm that kept them open. To survive in a court poisoned by betrayal, where siblings became enemies and Rome hovered like a predator above Egypt, she needed more than charm. She needed rational self-command. That is why her enemies misunderstood her. They mistook quiet confidence for seduction and strategic patience for manipulation. But as William B. Irvine warns, true power is the ability to remain unshaken when the world tries to pull you into its chaos. Cleopatra lived inside chaos from childhood, watching alliances collapse, armies desert, and advisors shift their loyalties like sand in the wind. Yet she cultivated something rare, an unbroken center. While others reacted, she anticipated. While others panicked, she observed. While others fought for image, she fought for survival with reason sharpened like a blade. Her strength was not vanity. It was stoic resilience. It was the discipline of a woman who refused to let circumstance dictate her identity. Zeno taught that the wise person moves through life with a steady mind, and Cleopatra embodied that steadiness even in the presence of emperors. Her influence did not overwhelm, it disarmed. Not because she was admired, but because she was composed. And in a world built on ego and impulsiveness, composure becomes a superpower. Her greatest impact was not the allure historians obsess over, but the mental discipline they could not understand. She did not conquer with appearance. She conquered with clarity. Number 2, the precision of influence without losing yourself. Influence is often misunderstood as seduction, as if guiding the decisions of others were nothing more than a performance. But Cleopatra's influence did not operate like theater. It functioned like a disciplined reading of human nature. She understood ambition, fear, pride, and the invisible insecurities that shaped the men who ruled the ancient world. And she used that understanding not to chase admiration, but to safeguard her people. Epictetus reminded us that freedom begins with mastery over the self, not over others. According to Epictetus, no one is free until they have learned to govern themselves. Cleopatra embodied this principle. She did not allow desire, approval, or ego to dictate her actions. Her influence came not from seeking validation, but from observing without becoming emotionally entangled. This is what separates manipulation from wisdom. Manipulation is driven by insecurity. Cleopatra's influence was driven by clarity. Modern philosophers like William B. Irvine emphasize that emotional control is the highest form of strategic power, especially in environments dominated by ego. According to William B. Irvine, weakness is revealed the moment you surrender your reason to impulse. Cleopatra never surrendered. She moved through the Roman political world like someone who had studied not just the behavior of men, but the architecture of their motivation. She recognized the hunger for recognition inside Julius Caesar, the heroic vanity inside Mark Antony, and the territorial pride inside every Roman senator who feared losing control. And she navigated all of it with precision instead of submission. This kind of influence requires emotional discipline. Zeno taught that the wise person observes human nature without becoming a prisoner of it. Cleopatra mastered this distance. She could engage deeply without dissolving into the expectations of those around her. Unlike many leaders who crumble under the weight of image, she remained anchored in intention. Her alliances were not romantic illusions. They were geopolitical calculations, crafted with the cold awareness of someone responsible for the survival of a nation trapped between empires. Influence becomes dangerous when it consumes the one who uses it. But Cleopatra never allowed herself to get lost in the personas the world projected onto her. She read human weakness without absorbing it. She shaped circumstances without being shaped by them. And that is why her power unsettled so many. She used influence as strategy, not as identity. True Stoic wisdom lies not in renouncing influence, but in exercising it without sacrificing the self. Cleopatra achieved that balance with a precision that still challenges our assumptions about strength, leadership, and the nature of power. Number 3, a leader who refused to bow. Leadership in the ancient world was not a stage for women. It was a battlefield dominated by generals, warlords, and politicians who expected obedience from everyone beneath them. Cleopatra entered this world not as an ornament, but as a force unwilling to diminish herself. She refused to bow to the traditions that demanded silence from women and submission from lesser nations. While many rulers secured safety by aligning themselves with Rome, she dared to remain independent. According to Marcus Aurelius, do what must be done with courage, whether anyone notices or not. Cleopatra lived by this principle long before it was written, taking on responsibilities that would have overwhelmed leaders with more support and fewer enemies. Her world was shaped by instability. Famine, civil unrest, rival siblings, Roman domination, and endless political tension defined every year of her reign. Yet she met each challenge with composure and an almost defiant rationality. She stepped into negotiations with Rome as an equal, not as a subordinate. She boarded ships during wartime, confronted generals face to face, and made decisions few men of her era would have taken without hesitation or fear. Her leadership was not reckless. It was intentional, grounded in the belief that a sovereign must act with clarity even when the world dismisses them. According to Seneca, courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Cleopatra understood fear intimately, but she refused to live beneath it. Her presence unsettled powerful men precisely because it contradicted the expectations of her era. Roman politicians expected her to be grateful for protection. Instead, she asserted herself. They expected her to be overwhelmed by political complexity. Instead, she mastered it. They expected her to be intimidated by their authority. Instead, she held her ground. In this sense, Cleopatra embodied a foundational Stoic virtue, autonomy of spirit. Leaders who rely on external validation cannot lead with integrity. Cleopatra operated from a deeper place, one governed by reason, not applause. As Donald Robertson reminds students of Stoicism, the Stoic leader acts with purpose, not for recognition, and Cleopatra's purpose was survival of her kingdom, not approval from Rome. Her leadership was a challenge to the world, not because she sought chaos, but because she represented a version of strength that ignored the conventions of gender, nationality, and power. She did not fight to be accepted. She fought to be effective. And effectiveness, in her case, meant protecting Egypt through strategy, diplomacy, and unshakable presence. She was not a leader who waited for permission. She was a leader who understood that reason, courage, and clarity are more powerful than titles or customs. Her refusal to bow was not rebellion for its own sake. It was the expression of a sovereign mind acting according to its own rational purpose. And that is why her legacy still disrupts our understanding of what true leadership looks like. Number 4, desire as a weapon. There is a particular danger in the kind of intelligence that can see beneath human behavior. Most people look at others and see their actions. Cleopatra looked at people and saw their cravings. Fear disguised as ambition. Loneliness disguised as pride. Ego disguised as confidence. She saw what powerful men wanted long before they dared to say it out loud. And once she understood those internal fractures, she could move entire kingdoms with nothing more than calibrated presence. Not because she manipulated emotions, but because she understood the architecture of desire. As modern philosopher William B. Irvine often reminds his students, we become vulnerable the moment we allow desire to guide our decisions. Cleopatra learned this lesson by watching the world around her break under the weight of its own impulses. She saw generals lose wars because they lusted for glory. She saw senators sabotage alliances because they hungered for reputation. She saw rulers destroy their own people because they wanted to be feared. Desire in her world was not passion. It was an unstable currency, and she used this instability the way a strategist uses terrain, not to corrupt, but to survive. Zeno warned his followers about this very danger centuries before Rome knew her name. Whoever becomes a slave to desire has lost the throne within. Cleopatra's brilliance was not in triggering desire, but in observing how easily others surrendered to it. She did not create the emotional storms inside the men around her. She simply understood them. Caesar wanted legacy. Antony wanted admiration. Rome wanted control. Each man believed he was acting from strength, when in reality he was acting from hunger. This is the very pattern Stoicism tries to expose. People lose themselves not through weakness, but through unexamined longing. And Cleopatra, navigating a world designed to erase her, used that knowledge with a precision that made her nearly untouchable. The mistake historians often make is imagining that Cleopatra weaponized seduction. What she weaponized was discipline. She stayed rational while powerful men drowned in their own impulses. She maintained composure while others collapsed into the desires they refused to confront. That is why her influence frightened empires. She did not raise armies, she raised awareness. She could stand in absolute stillness while the world around her fought imaginary battles inside their own chests. And in that stillness, she revealed something uncomfortable about human nature. People are not undone by external enemies. They are undone by the desires they refuse to master. Cleopatra's use of desire was not vice, it was a mirror. And every man who came close to her faced a reflection he was not prepared to see. That reflection showed exactly what Stoic philosophy has warned for centuries. Power is never lost to another person. It is lost to the cravings that fracture the self. Cleopatra simply understood that truth earlier than most. Number 5. Ambition unchecked. Ambition is a double-edged force. It builds nations, drives innovation, and pushes human beings to defy their circumstances. But when ambition grows faster than the ability to govern it, it becomes a silent threat. Cleopatra lived in a world where playing small meant extinction. Rome devoured kingdoms that hesitated. Leaders who lacked vision were erased. And in that pressure, ambition became both shield and shadow. She did not want to rule quietly. She wanted Egypt to stand with dignity in a world determined to shrink it. Yet the same fire that propelled her forward sometimes pulled her toward dreams too large to contain. As contemporary Stoic thinker Donald Robertson often explains, ambition without clarity becomes a pursuit of mirrors. Cleopatra's clarity never failed her in strategy, but ambition has a unique way of testing even the strongest mind. Zeno warned that every person carries a battlefield within themselves. Excess is the enemy of the soul. And in the ancient world, excess was not luxury. It was longing without measure. Cleopatra wanted security for her people, but she also wanted legacy. She wanted sovereignty, but she also wanted to be remembered. She wanted independence, but she also sought a stage large enough to match her vision. Rome was too dangerous to trust and too powerful to ignore. To navigate such a landscape required courage, but it also required restraint, a virtue even the greatest leaders struggle to hold. History often judges Cleopatra as if she were driven by vanity alone, but the truth is more complicated. Her ambition was born from responsibility, not ego. Egypt was surrounded by predators, and she knew that survival demanded audacity. But ambition has a subtle gravity. It pulls leaders toward decisions that blur the line between protecting a nation and building a monument to oneself. Marcus Aurelius cautioned his own commanders about this temptation. Remember that the pursuit of greatness must never consume the harmony within. And Cleopatra's harmony, despite her discipline, was challenged by the scale of what she attempted. Aligning with Caesar elevated Egypt. Aligning with Antony threatened Rome. Each choice strengthened her position while simultaneously magnifying her risks. This is the tragedy hidden inside ambition. It gives clarity while quietly creating blind spots. Cleopatra saw the political landscape with unmatched precision, yet even she could not fully escape the instinct to build something eternal. Stoicism teaches that true greatness is measured not by the size of one's influence, but by the steadiness of one's character. Cleopatra's ambition was powerful, visionary, and at times necessary. But it carried her into conflicts shaped not just by strategy, but by the weight of desire for something more. And the desire for more, even when noble, has toppled empires since the beginning of history. Cleopatra's story reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature. Ambition is not dangerous because it pushes us forward. It is dangerous because it makes us forget where forward ends. It convinces us that the next victory will finally be enough. The next alliance will finally secure peace. The next conquest will finally define the legacy we crave. But Stoicism reminds us that mastery is not found in expansion, but in equilibrium. Cleopatra reached for a world larger than the one she inherited, and in that reach she discovered what every powerful mind eventually faces. Ambition without inner balance is a throne built on shifting sand. Number 6. Turning giants into prisoners of emotion. Powerful men often imagine themselves unshakable. Commanders speak to armies as if their will alone holds the world together. Politicians believe they are immune to the chaos they inflict. Generals trust that discipline and conquest have hardened them. But Cleopatra exposed something none of these men were prepared to face. She showed that even the strongest leaders can become prisoners of the emotions they refuse to master. Julius Caesar commanded legions, but he could not command his longing for legacy. Mark Antony dominated battlefields, but he could not dominate his hunger for admiration. Their power collapsed not because Cleopatra was irresistible, but because they were untrained in the one battlefield Stoicism considers essential: the human mind. Modern philosopher William B. Irvine often warns that emotional vulnerability hides beneath the appearance of strength. He teaches that people fall not from a lack of power, but from a lack of psychological discipline. Strength without self-control is simply a prelude to collapse. Cleopatra never needed to overpower these men. All she had to do was remain still while they revealed themselves. They arrived believing they were in control. They left realizing they were ruled by impulses they had never examined. Zeno understood this danger centuries earlier, urging his students to see emotional entanglement as a form of internal enslavement. He who is mastered by emotion has surrendered the throne within. When Cleopatra moved through rooms filled with commanders, politicians, and strategists, she was the only one who did not serve an invisible master. She did not chase validation. She did not cling to admiration. She did not need to be worshipped. This is why her presence destabilized the powerful. She represented a kind of grounded awareness that exposed the fractures in their armor. They mistook desire for direction, attachment for loyalty, and infatuation for clarity. To a Stoic, these are not signs of love or devotion. They are signs of inner imbalance. Mark Antony believed he was choosing Cleopatra. In reality, he was choosing the emotional storm he had ignored for decades. Julius Caesar believed he was protecting her. In truth, he was protecting the image of greatness he feared losing. Cleopatra did not enslave these men. Their own unexamined desires did. And this is the essence of human frailty that Stoicism tries to illuminate. Power is not the ability to command others. It is the ability to remain unshaken by the urges that try to command you. Cleopatra exposed this truth by simply maintaining what the Stoics valued most: presence. Her enemies believed discipline was shown on battlefields. She understood discipline begins in the mind, and while these men ruled armies, she ruled herself. That difference was enough to turn giants into prisoners, not because she was extraordinary, but because they were unprepared to face themselves. Number 7. The Stoic judgment on Cleopatra. History often divides Cleopatra into extremes. To some, she was a genius of strategy, to others, a danger disguised as charm. But the Stoic lens demands a different approach. It does not ask whether someone was loved or hated, admired or condemned. It asks only whether they acted from clarity or from impulse. When we examine Cleopatra from this perspective, we find a woman whose brilliance was undeniable, but whose inner battles revealed the limits of her discipline. She moved through political chaos with remarkable composure, made decisions that required enormous courage, and protected Egypt far longer than the world expected. Yet even the strongest minds face fractures when navigating power at this scale. Modern Stoic writer Donald Robertson often speaks about this tension inside high performers. He observes that even the most capable leaders can drift from virtue when the weight of ambition grows heavier than their ability to remain centered. When the quest for impact overrides self-governance, wisdom becomes distorted. Cleopatra demonstrated extraordinary strength in her ability to understand human behavior, remain calm under pressure, and lead with purpose in a world that underestimated her. But the closer she came to shaping the destiny of empires, the more she faced the dangers that Marcus Aurelius warned his own generals about centuries later. Nothing threatens a leader more than the illusions they willingly accept. Cleopatra's clarity was strongest when she protected Egypt, negotiated with Rome, and read the intentions of powerful men with unsettling precision. But clarity becomes harder to sustain when ambition expands faster than self-awareness. Building an alliance with Julius Caesar strengthened her country. Attempting to shape a new geopolitical order alongside Mark Antony exposed her to the gravitational pull of Rome's internal chaos. The more she tried to control, the more the world around her demanded a kind of purity no human being can maintain indefinitely. Her life is not a case study in virtue or in vice. It is a demonstration of how complex leadership becomes when reason meets desire, when responsibility meets ambition, and when survival meets identity. Cleopatra operated with more rational discipline than most rulers of her era, but she also revealed how even a brilliant mind can be tested by visions that stretch beyond its spiritual center. Stoicism reminds us that the danger is not being powerful. The danger is believing power grants immunity from self-reflection. Cleopatra's legacy forces a sobering recognition. She was neither saint nor villain. She was human in the most intense sense of the word, capable of extraordinary clarity and vulnerable to the same internal storms that challenge every person who rises to influence. In the Stoic judgment, she stands not as a myth to be worshipped or a figure to be condemned, but as a reminder that greatness without inner harmony always walks the edge of collapse. And that edge, no matter how brilliantly one navigates it, eventually asks a price. Number 8. The hidden legacy of strategic presence. Cleopatra's name has traveled through centuries wrapped in myth, drama, and half-truths. But beneath the noise, there is a more subtle legacy that modern life desperately needs to rediscover. She understood that the world is shaped not by appearance itself, but by the way people relate to appearance. In the society that rewarded spectacle, she used presence as a shield. In a political system obsessed with dominance, she used composure as a form of resistance. Her true brilliance was not in captivating rooms, but in controlling the space within herself, so that the chaos around her never dictated her identity. This is a kind of mastery the modern world rarely teaches, even though it hungers for it more than ever. Contemporary Stoic author Ryan Holiday often emphasizes this failing in the age of constant exposure. He warns that people lose themselves because they allow visibility to replace virtue. In a world addicted to attention, the rarest strength is the ability to stay rooted. Cleopatra understood this intuitively. She lived in a time when political survival depended on perception, yet she refused to be consumed by it. She used image strategically, not emotionally. She stepped into roles with intention, not insecurity, but she never mistook the performance for the person. This distinction made her dangerous to Rome. They wielded power through intimidation. She wielded power through self-possession. And centuries before cameras, screens, and algorithms demanded that humans turn themselves into brands, Marcus Aurelius issued a warning that might as well have been written for our generation. A person loses themselves the moment they let the world shape their worth. Today, people trade authenticity for approval without even noticing the transaction. They reshape their identity to fit expectations they don't truly believe in, chasing recognition they don't truly desire. Cleopatra's story exposes this modern trap with uncomfortable clarity. She did not confuse her image with her essence. She used one to protect the other. She shaped perception without being shaped by it. Stoicism teaches that the truest power is the ability to remain inwardly steady while the world attempts to pull you into its narrative. Cleopatra mastered this skill long before the philosophy found its modern resurgence. Her legacy is not a lesson in seduction or manipulation. It is a lesson in intentional presence, to move through life without letting the noise of others define your direction, to project confidence without becoming addicted to validation, to use identity as a tool without surrendering your inner center. Most people build their sense of self from the outside inward, absorbing whatever the world reflects back at them. Cleopatra lived from the inside outward, and that difference, more than her alliances or her political maneuvers, is what preserved her name across time. Her story challenges us to confront how easily the modern world fractures our sense of self. It reminds us that influence means nothing without inner stability, and that presence becomes destructive the moment it stops serving purpose. Cleopatra understood that the world will always demand more than you can give if you let it define you. Her hidden legacy invites us to refuse that demand, to live with intention instead of reaction, to treat appearance not as identity, but as a tool, and to cultivate a self that remains unshaken, no matter how loudly the world insists on being heard. Cleopatra's story survives not because she fit neatly into the categories history loves so much, but because she broke them. She was a strategist who understood human nature with unsettling clarity, a leader who refused to let the world dictate her limits, and a thinker who relied on presence more than spectacle. Her life reveals something the Stoics have been trying to teach for more than 2,000 years. The greatest battles we fight are not against rivals, critics, or circumstances. They are fought inside the self, and even the strongest among us can lose ground when identity becomes tangled with ego, desire, or the need to be seen. Modern philosopher Donald Robertson often reminds his readers that the human mind becomes fragile the moment it forgets its own foundations. We suffer most when we build our identity on things we cannot control. This truth was alive in Cleopatra's triumphs and in her failures. Her discipline gave her power. Her clarity gave her influence. But at times, even she drifted toward visions larger than her inner balance could sustain. Marcus Aurelius warned that no achievement, no legacy, and no victory is worth losing the harmony of one's own mind. Hold fast to what grounds you, or the world will pull you in every direction at once. Cleopatra's life forces us to confront the same choice she faced, whether to live shaped by reaction, emotion, and external noise, or to cultivate a presence so intentional that the world cannot pull us away from ourselves. Influence without inner mastery collapses. Ambition without self-awareness consumes, and identity without grounding becomes a performance staged for an audience that forgets us as quickly as it applauds. The Stoic path is the opposite of the world's demands. It is not a pursuit of admiration. It is the pursuit of alignment. It is not about appearing strong. It is about being steady. Cleopatra mastered some of these principles with brilliance and struggled with others, just as we all do. Her legacy is not a verdict. It is an invitation. So now I turn the question to you. After everything we explored, how do you see Cleopatra? A brilliant strategist misunderstood by history, or a dangerously insightful leader who exposed the weaknesses of those around her? Leave your judgment in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective, and if this video brought you reflection, clarity, or discomfort in the best possible way, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs this insight, and subscribe to the Stoic Lighthouse. Your support helps us bring more depth, more philosophy, and more guidance to those searching for steadiness in a chaotic world. As for what comes next, prepare yourself. In our next video, we will explore a truth most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. A truth that quietly drains strength, destroys confidence, and keeps millions trapped without even realizing it. We are going to uncover why running from discomfort is silently shaping your life, and how facing it head-on might be the only path to real freedom. Stay close. You will not want to miss this. Because at the end of every struggle, every doubt, and every moment of fear, one truth remains. The mind you refuse to confront will eventually become the master you serve. See you in the next video.